The rain had been falling for hours, soft and steady, tapping against the high arched windows of the castle. Candle flames wavered in the long corridors, casting trembling shadows over stone walls draped with tapestries. The hour was late, so late that the servants had retired to their narrow quarters. The guards paced in their slow, predictable rhythm along the outer walls, and the air had taken on a hushed stillness that comes only when the world believes it is entirely alone. I had not meant to see her that night. The great hall was dim, a handful of candles left burned low in their holders, the scent of beeswax and rain-damp stone hanging in the air. I had gone there in search of a book I'd left by the fire earlier in the evening, a book whose words had already begun to blur in my mind, though I'd read them countless times before. Yet as I stepped into the hall, I saw her, standing by the tall window, one hand pressed against the glass, her gaze far away. She wore a gown the color of deep wine, the velvet catching what little light there was, and holding it like something precious. Her hair fell loose over her shoulders, the long strands darkened by the rain's mist. I knew her name, of course. How could I not? Lady Alara of Westhaven, the woman whispered about in corridors, spoken of with equal parts awe and envy. She was not mine to touch, not mine to hold, not even mine to speak to in such an hour. And yet, that night, she was there, alone. She turned at the sound of my steps, her eyes locking on mine. There was no startle, no polite surprise. Instead, something softer, a question, unspoken, hanging between us like the moment before a candle flickers out. "You're awake," she said, her voice low, as if speaking any louder might shatter the fragile quiet of the hall. "I couldn't sleep," I replied. "The rain." She glanced back to the window, as though considering the sound anew. "It is relentless tonight." There was nothing urgent in her tone, and yet I felt a pull toward her. I crossed the hall slowly, my boots whispering against the stone, and stopped a few steps away. The air between us seemed charged, not with lightning, but with something warmer, slower, and far more dangerous. "Does it always rain like this in Westhaven?" I asked, if only to keep her eyes on me a little longer. "Not always," she murmured, "but when it does, it feels as though the world had forgotten the sun." Her fingers had left a faint trace of moisture on the glass. Without thinking, I reached for the sill beside her hand, my palm brushing against hers for the briefest moment. She didn't move away. The contact was small, barely a touch, but it felt louder than any sound in the room. "I suppose," I said slowly, "that makes nights like these feel endless." A faint curve touched her lips, not quite a smile. "And what would you do with an endless night?" The question sank into me, slow and deep. My mind offered a dozen answers, each one more dangerous than the last. But instead, I simply held her gaze. The sound of rain became louder, the rest of the castle fading into nothingness. "I'm not sure," I admitted, "but I think I'd want company." She let the silence linger before she stepped away from the window, the hem of her gown whispering across the floor. She moved past me, and for a moment her shoulder brushed mine. The scent of her, soft florals and something faintly sweet, like summer fruit, followed her steps. I turned to watch her as she approached the long oak table at the center of the hall. There, she ran her fingertips lightly over the carved wood, as though tracing a memory. "The others sleep," she said. "No one will come here until morning." Her voice carried an undertone now, one I couldn't quite name, but it set something restless in my chest. I took a slow step toward her, then another, until I stood at the edge of the table. She didn't look up. Her fingers reached the end of the table and stilled. Without thinking, I extended my hand toward hers. When my fingertips touched the back of her hand, she didn't pull away. Instead, she turned her palm upward, her skin warm against mine. For a moment, we simply stood there, two figures in a vast, empty hall, holding hands as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The fire in the grate across the room cracked softly, sending a ribbon of warmth through the air. "Your hands are cold," I murmured. "And yours are warm," she replied, her thumb brushing once over my knuckles. The movement was small, but it sent a line of heat up my arm. Her gaze lifted then, meeting mine fully. There was no rush in her eyes, only the slow certainty of someone who knew exactly what she wanted and was deciding whether or not to take it. "I shouldn't be here with you," she said softly. "I know." And yet, her words trailed off, but she didn't finish the thought. Instead, she stepped closer, the space between us narrowing until I could feel the faint warmth of her breath. My other hand rose, hesitant, searching, until it rested lightly on her waist. She didn't move away. For the first time that night, she smiled, small, almost secret. "You're bolder than I thought." "Only tonight," I said. "Maybe only this moment." The rain outside drummed harder against the windows, as though urging us closer. I could feel the smooth velvet of her gown under my fingertips, the slow rise and fall of her breathing. And then, as though some unspoken thread had pulled us both at once, she tightened her hold on my hand. I tightened mine in return. Neither of us let go. We stood there for what felt like a long time. Long enough for the sound of fire to settle into the rhythm of our breaths. Long enough for the world outside the hall to cease existing. Her thumb traced idle patterns over my hand, and I realized that this, the slowness, the warmth, the quiet defiance, was more intoxicating than any rush of passion. At last, she whispered, "If we don't move now, we never will." "Then we won't," I replied. Her eyes searched mine, and I saw in them the same thought I've been holding back all evening, that there are some nights you don't run from, some hands you don't release, no matter the cost. The night was ours, and for now it wasn't ending. The great hall felt smaller now, though nothing in it had changed. Perhaps it was because we hadn't moved apart, our hands still intertwined, our breath now carrying across the few inches that separated us. The fire's glow spilled softly over her cheek, catching the curve of her jaw, the subtle glint in her eyes. She tilted her head slightly, studying me as though weighing something unseen. Then, with a slow grace, she stepped back, not to lead, but to guide me. Her hand tugged gently, the tips of her fingers curling around mine, drawing me toward the shadowed doorway at the far end of the hall. "Come," she said quietly. I followed without question. The corridor beyond was dim, lit only by a line of candles mounted high along the wall. Their light shimmered over the dark stone, catching on old tapestries depicting hunts and royal feasts. The faint scent of lavender drifted through the air, subtle, perhaps from the sachets the servants placed along the corridors. Our steps were slow, unhurried, the only sound a muted echo of boots and slippers against the flagstones. Her hand stayed in mine, her grip neither tight nor loose, but certain, like a promise that whatever lay ahead, we would arrive together. The hallway narrowed and turned, leading us deeper into the quieter parts of the castle. My mind should have been wary, should have counted the risk of being seen, but the thought barely formed before it dissolved again. All that existed was the soft pull of her hand, the movement of her gown brushing against the floor, and the quiet thrum beneath my ribs. We stopped before a small arched door, almost hidden between two heavy curtains. She released my hand only long enough to lift the latch. The hinges gave a soft creak as the door opened to a room unlike the rest of the castle's stone halls. It was warm here, the air infused with the scent of burning wood, and something faintly sweet. Rose, perhaps. A low fire burned in the hearth, its light falling over shelves lined with books, the worn edges of velvet chairs, and a small table set with an unfinished glass of wine. She stepped inside, and I followed, letting the door close quietly behind us. The room seemed made for shadows, the corners soft and dim, the firelight painting everything in gold. "This was my father's library," she said, her voice quieter here. "No one comes anymore, not at this hour." She crossed to the window, the rain still streaking down the glass, and rested her hand against the sill. For a moment, she simply watched the darkness beyond, as though gathering her thoughts. I let my eyes take in the space, the way the books leaned against one another as though in conversation, the faint wear in the carpet where someone had paced often, the curve of her back beneath the folds of her gown. "You've brought me to a place that feels like it remembers," I said. Her gaze flicked toward me, a small smile touching her lips. "Perhaps it does." She moved to the table and poured another glass of wine, the deep red liquid catching the firelight. She held it out to me, her fingers brushing mine as I took it. Then she poured a second glass for herself. We stood by the fire, the warmth seeping slowly into my shoulders, the wine leaving its dark trace along my tongue. Neither of us spoke for a while, and it struck me that silence was not an absence between us, but a presence, something that wrapped around us as tangibly as the heat from the flames. She set her glass down, untouched beyond that first sip, and crossed the space between us. Her hand rose to my collar, fingertips lightly adjusting the fold of the fabric, as though such a small touch might occupy her completely. My own hand lifted in response, finding the curve of her arm just above the elbow. The velvet of her sleeve was smooth beneath my palm, the warmth of her skin alive beneath it. "You're still warm," she said, her voice barely more than a breath. "And you're still here," I replied, her lips curved, not in amusement, but in something closer to agreement. The distance between us narrowed again, until I could see the way the firelight shifted in her eyes. She reached for my hand once more, this time guiding it slowly upward, until my fingers rested just above her heart. It beat steadily beneath my touch, though faster than before. Her other hand found mine at her waist, pressing it more firmly into place. She was guiding me, shaping the moment with movements so subtle they felt inevitable. "You don't let go easily," she murmured. "Not when I shouldn't," I said. She studied me for a heartbeat longer, and then her head tilted slightly, enough to bring her closer, enough to let her forehead brush against mine. The contact was small, but it carried a kind of weight that made everything else fade. We stayed like that for a long moment, the quiet and the heat drawing around us. Then she stepped back, not away, but toward the nearest chair. She sank into it with slow grace, her gown pooling like liquid around her. Her eyes held mine, the faintest invitation in them, though she said nothing. I set my wine aside and moved toward her, the space between us closing until I stood before the chair. Her hand reached out, palm upward, and I took it. The softness of her skin against mine was a contrast to the slight strength in her grip, as though she meant to remind me that even in such quiet, she was the one leading. Her thumb traced the back of my hand, slow and deliberate. The fire crackled. Somewhere beyond the walls, the rain softened, but I hardly noticed. In that stillness, there was no thought of dawn, no thought of consequence. Only the quiet truth that the night was long, and neither of us had any intention of letting go. The rain outside had softened to a faint whisper, the steady rhythm against the glass now almost like breathing. Inside the library, the fire had settled lower, its glow deepening into a richer, more intimate amber. Shadows swayed across the walls, curling in the corners like quiet secrets. Her hand was still in mine, warm and steady, the only anchor I needed in that moment. She hadn't spoken for some time, nor had I, but the silence didn't feel empty. It felt deliberate, as though we were both holding back words that would change everything if spoken aloud. At last, she rose from a chair with the same slow grace she'd had when she first crossed the great hall. My hand stayed in hers as she stepped toward the tall shelves, her fingers trailing over the spines of books worn soft with age. She didn't seem to be searching for a title. She simply moved as if reacquainting herself with each volume, touching them the way one might trace the memory of a face. I followed, watching the line of her shoulders beneath the deep wine velvet of her gown. "You know every book in this room, don't you?" I asked quietly. Her lips curved faintly, though she didn't turn. "Every book worth reading." "And which are those?" She glanced at me over her shoulder, the flicker of the fire catching the side of her face. "The ones you cannot read, without remembering the way they made you feel." She stopped before a book set slightly apart from the others and slid it free, her fingertips brushing the edges as she turned toward me. "This one," she said, placing it into my hands. The cover was worn but still beautiful, the leather soft under my fingers. I turned it over, letting the gold lettering catch the light. A collection of poetry. Her gaze held mine. "Read one to me." It wasn't a request. It was a quiet command, though her tone made it sound like an invitation. I opened the book, scanning the lines until my eyes found one that seemed to belong to the room, to the night, to her. I read slowly, my voice low, letting the rhythm of the words carry between us. "When the world sleeps, I will watch your breath, count the beats beneath your hand, and let the night keep us, where no one will find us, The words hung in the air for a moment, and I felt her move closer, just close enough that the edge of her gown brushed the front of my coat. She reached for the book, but instead of taking it, her fingers curled gently around my wrist, lowering my hand until the book rested at my side. "Some words," she murmured, "are meant to be lived, not read." Her other hand found mine again, weaving our fingers together with a slow certainty. She didn't break eye contact as she began to walk, pulling me with her toward a narrow door at the far end of the library. The hinges gave a soft sigh as she pushed it open, revealing a spiraling staircase lit by only 2 wall sconces. The steps were narrow, the kind that demanded you walk close. She didn't let go of my hand, not even when the space between us narrowed so much that her shoulder brushed against my chest. The air grew cooler as we climbed, the stone walls close on either side. I could smell the faintest trace of her perfume again, warm and sweet, lingering just enough to keep me aware of every step she took ahead of me. When we reached the top, she pushed open another small door, and I realized we had entered one of the castle's upper towers. The room here was smaller than I expected, round, with a high ceiling and tall, arched windows that looked out into the rain-soft night. Candles had been left here, though unlit. She moved them first, striking flint until flames bloomed, one by one, casting the chamber in a gentle gold. The light caught the dust in the air, turning it into drifting motes that seemed to dance in time with the flicker of the wicks. From here, the view was endless. The dark shapes of trees swaying below, the silver gleam of the river winding to the land, and above it all, a sky heavy with clouds that hid the moon. She stood by the window, one hand resting lightly on the stone sill, the other still holding mine. "This was my mother's place," she said softly. "She came here when the world was too loud." I stepped closer, my free hand resting against the cold stone beside hers. "And tonight?" Her eyes found mine in the candlelight. "Tonight, I didn't want to be alone." The air between us shifted, warmer, closer, as if the words had closed whatever space still remained. My hand tightened gently around hers, and I felt the answering pressure in her grip. Neither of us moved for a moment, letting the weight of the night settle around us. She turned slightly, her face just a breath away from mine now. "You haven't let go once," she said, her voice low. "Maybe I can't," I murmured. She studied me, her gaze slow and searching, and then she lifted our joined hands until they rested between us, her other hand covering mine. "Then don't." The rain outside whispered against the windows, the sound folding into the stillness of the tower. I felt the heat from her skin through the space our hands created, the rhythm of her pulse matching my own. We stood like that for what felt like an hour, neither speaking, neither moving. The world outside could have fallen away, and I wouldn't have noticed. All I knew was the weight and warmth of her touch, the quiet tether that kept us in that moment. When she finally moved, it was only to step closer, so close that the edge of her gown brushed over my boots, so close that her breath warmed my cheek. She didn't kiss me. She didn't need to. Every inch of space between us had already been claimed by something far stronger than words. The tower chamber had its own kind of silence. Thicker, deeper, the kind that seemed to press against the skin. The candles burned steadily now, their flames low but unwavering, the wax beginning to pool at their bases. Shadows moved softly across the curved walls, and the rain outside had slowed to an almost imperceptible drizzle. Her hand was still in mine. It felt as though it had been there for a lifetime, though in truth it had only been an hour, maybe less. Time didn't feel quite real here. She stood close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from her, though our bodies hadn't fully met. It was a strange, deliberate kind of closeness, an intimacy built in the space between rather than in the act of touching. Her gaze held mine for a long, quiet moment before she spoke. "Do you know why I brought you here?" I shook my head slowly. "This is the highest room in the castle," she said. "The furthest from anyone else. No footsteps reach here. No voices carry. You can speak or stay silent, and it will belong to only us." Her voice was even, but there was a softness at the edges, a vulnerability, maybe. I could feel in the way her fingers curled slightly tighter around mine, like she was making sure I was still there. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I reached with my free hand and, very slowly, brushed back the strand of hair that had fallen across her cheek. The movement was gentle enough that she didn't flinch, only let her eyes close for the briefest second before opening them again. Her lips curved faintly. You make it hard to remember that I should keep my distance. You're the one who brought me here, I said quietly. Her eyes lingered on mine, and for a moment I thought she might reply, but she didn't. Instead, she turned, leading me further into the chamber. There was a low chaise set near the window, its deep cushions covered in soft, faded fabric. She sat first, gathering the folds of her gown, so they draped neatly at her side. Then she looked up at me with that same wordless invitation I'd seen before. I sat beside her, close enough that the edges of our clothes touched. She shifted slightly, our knees brushing, and the contact sent a slow ripple of awareness through me. Neither of us spoke for some time. We simply sat there, our hands still joined, watching the clouds move past the windows. Every so often, a faint gleam of moonlight slipped through a break in the clouds, spilling silver over her hair. "You watch me," she said after a while, her tone soft but sure. I didn't deny it. "You make it difficult not to." She turned her head toward me, the corner of her mouth lifting just slightly. "And if I asked you not to?" "I wouldn't be able to promise that," I replied. For a moment, something like amusement flickered in her eyes. But then she reached with her free hand and placed it lightly on my chest, over my heart. I felt the faint press of her palm through the fabric, the subtle warmth of her skin. Her gaze dropped to where our hands rested, hers on my chest, mine still holding hers. "You've kept my hand all this time," she said. "Yes." "Why?" I met her eyes again. "Because if I let go, I'm afraid the night will end." She studied me for a heartbeat, then two. Then she leaned in, not quite close enough to kiss, but close enough that I could feel her breath mingle with mine. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Then don't let go." The space between us narrowed further. I could see every detail. The faint catch of candlelight in her eyes, the slow rise and fall of her breath, the way her fingers curled slightly against my chest. I lifted my other hand and very carefully rested it at her jaw, my thumb brushing lightly along the curve of her cheek. She didn't move away. Instead, she closed her eyes for a moment, as though committing the touch to memory. When she opened them again, the softness there had deepened into something more certain. "Do you know what happens when you hold someone's hand too long?" she asked. "What?" "They stop remembering where they end, and you begin." The word seemed to hang between us like a promise, or perhaps a warning. My grip on her hand tightened just slightly, and hers answered in kind. We stayed like that, the world narrowing to the warmth of her palm against mine, the quiet, steady beat beneath her touch on my chest, and the slow, unbroken gaze between us. The night beyond the windows moved on, clouds drifting, the rain finally easing, but here in the tower, time seemed to fold on itself. She didn't move away, and neither did I. If you want, I can take part 5 into the slow, lingering climax of this whole night, keeping it sensual and emotionally charged, so it feels like the inevitable culmination of all 4 parts while still safe for YouTube. That way, it will truly feel like a complete 1 hour, Hold your breath, romance. The candles had burned lower now, their pools of wax wide, their flames thin but steady. The chamber felt warmer, though the fire in the small hearth had burned down to embers. I couldn't tell if it was the air or the nearness of her. We had not broken the thread between us, her hand still enclosed in mine. It was as though our fingers had learned the shape of each other, fitting together without thought. Her eyes wandered over my face, unhurried, as though she were memorizing me in the same quiet way I had been memorizing her. "You don't seem afraid of me," she said at last. "Should I be?" I asked. "Yes," she murmured, but there was a faint curve at her lips that betrayed her. I leaned a little closer, enough that my shoulder brushed hers. "You don't seem afraid of me either." She tilted her head, the candlelight catching in her hair. "I'm not sure if that's wise." "Probably not," I said. The air between us shifted then, slightly heavier, warmer, and threaded through with a kind of unspoken inevitability. Her fingers curled more securely around mine, and without thinking, my thumb brushed over the soft skin between her knuckles. She exhaled, slow and quiet, like that single touch had drawn something out of her. Her gaze dipped to my mouth for the briefest instant before returning to my eyes. It was enough. I raised my free hand again, letting the backs of my fingers trail along her cheek. Her eyes fluttered closed, just for a second, and when they opened, there was no distance left in them, no walls, no guardedness. We were leaning toward each other now without thought, drawn by some current that neither of us had the will to resist. I could feel the heat of her breath against my lips, could see the faint tremor of her lashes as she hesitated, just long enough to be certain. When our lips met, it was not hurried. It was the slowest kind of claiming, the kind that draws a moment out until it feels like it could last forever. Her mouth was warm and soft against mine, her fingers tightening almost imperceptibly in my hand. The kiss deepened gradually, like the tide drawing in, gentle then fuller, then leaving us both breathless in its wake. When she pulled back, it was only far enough to look at me, her forehead resting lightly against mine. "Now," she whispered, "you can't let go." I wasn't planning to. She smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried both relief and surrender. Then she shifted, leaning into me until her head rested against my shoulder. My arm moved instinctively around her, holding her as though we had been meant to fit this way all along. We sat like that for a long time, the only sounds a soft crackle from the hearth and the faint sigh of the wind outside the tower. Her hair brushed against my jaw, her breathing slow and even, and I could feel the subtle rhythm of her pulse where our hands remained linked. After a while, she spoke again, quietly, almost reluctantly. "When morning comes, it will be different." I turned my head slightly so I could see her face. "Do you want it to be?" Her eyes searched mine, and I could see the truth there before she answered. No. The fire had burned down to a dull red glow, and the candles were near their ends, their flames wavering. We stayed there, wrapped in each other's warmth, until the light in the room belonged more to the moon than to any flame. The night stretched on, timeless and unbroken, and through it all, our hands never let go.